Welcome to the Queer Spirituality Podcast. I'm your host, Julian Crosson-Hill. This podcast is about an idea. It's the radical idea that queerness is a gift and that the divine celebrates it rather than merely accepts it. We'll explore the special role that queer people are meant to play in the coming spiritual awakening. Through the lives and stories of queer people, we'll explore the many ways of approaching the divine and how the sacred reveals itself in everyday actions. Most of all, this is a podcast about love. It's about the love of the universe, it's about love between people, and it's about the love a community can share with one another. Thank you for joining me. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Queer Spirituality Podcast. I'm your host, Julian Crosson-Hill, and with me today I have a very special guest, Thumper Forge. Thumper Marjorie Splitfoot Forge is a Gardnerian high priest, an initiate of the Minoan Brotherhood, a Discordian episcopos, a recovering alcoholic, and a notary public from Houston, Texas. His first book, Virgo Witch, Divining the Details, was co-authored with Ivo Dominguez Jr., and was released by Llewellyn Publications in November of 2023. By day, he manages a leather and fetish wear shop, and by night, he dabbles in chaos magic, offers geomantic and lithomantic readings, and blogs irreverently for Patheos Pagan. His essays have previously appeared in The Gorgon's Guide to Magical Resistance and Modern Witchcraft with the Greek Gods, History, Insights, and Magical Practice. Welcome to the show, Thumper.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fun talking to all these different people about their spiritual path and how it relates to their queerness. So I ask every guest right out of the gate, what does queer spirituality mean for you?
Well, for me, spirituality in general is the process of becoming who we're supposed to be. And so for queer spirituality, I see it as the process of becoming who we're supposed to be as queer people, but also just embracing kind of the specialness and magic of our queerness.
I love that, because I think the specialness and the magic of our queerness is really an important part that often gets overlooked. We hear about spiritual paths that accept or tolerate queerness, but not that really embrace the gift that queerness can be. So I really love that you include that in your definition. I'm curious about the idea of becoming who you're supposed to be or who you're meant to be. Like, how does someone figure that out if they're not?
That is something that actually for me started with 12-step recovery. I got sober about 11 and a half years ago. And so that involved going to a lot of meetings and drinking a lot of coffee. And in the meetings that I was attending, I would always hear people talk about spirituality and how important spirituality was and being a spiritual person. But nobody ever offered a definition of it. It was something that everybody kind of understood, but nobody really was explaining what they meant when they said it. So I just kind of started doing my own research on that and looking up definitions and looking at how different people explain spirituality. And for me, as being somebody in recovery, becoming who I was supposed to be meant somebody who wasn't overwhelmed with my addiction. And, getting that out of the way so that I could be who I was supposed to be without this big kind of alcoholic haze in front of me. So that's where it started for me. That's how I started playing with that definition.
Yeah, I love that 12 steps sort of does that for a lot of people. And it's interesting too, when I talk to people who are in recovery, there's sort of this phase that they go through, or this stage where there's almost like they have to rebuild community, because so much of queer culture revolves around drugs and alcohol, unfortunately. So how did you sort of navigate that in the early stages of that process?
I fell in with a group of guys who were sober and into the leather scene, and which was not something that I had a lot of background in. But there was a group of guys who either had been involved in leather before they got sober and were trying to figure out how to get back into that community or that culture. And there were other guys who had no interest in leather until they got sober. And so we just started kind of meeting on our own and going to leather events as a group and kind of presenting ourselves as our own little leather club. And it was sort of a transient group in that everyone involved kind of went their own way, but most of us ended up involved in some aspect of the leather community. But we were able to do that because we had this kind of support network uh, to figure all that out with.
Yeah, that's great. And it's wonderful when people can find those sort of affinity groups and also explore things that they maybe hadn't explored before. I always think it's interesting, and I noticed in your bio you manage now a leather and fetish wear shop, and it's interesting that the Venn diagram of queer leather, BDSM, and alternate spirituality has such a large overlap. Like, why do you think that is?
I think it has to do with, for me at least, the idea of subculture within subculture, and there are any number of queer people and men who love men who live, I don't want to say average lives, but who just sort of you know don't delve into spirituality and don't delve into anything alternative. And for a lot of us, once we find our place within something alternative, then we're like, well, what else is there? And so we start seeking in other directions.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like you become addictive to the subcultures. It's like, okay, what other
Exactly.
subculture can I explore? Yeah, yeah,
Very much. And I
definitely.
also think that the pagan community and the leather community are very similar in a lot of ways. There's just very similar dynamics. Um, whether it's small groups coming together with other small groups to create larger groups, or on the more negative side, the big fish in small ponds. But because the dynamics are so similar, it's easy to move from one into the other and kind of move back and forth between those cultures.
Yeah, definitely. So you've written a few books and done a number of things. And your spirituality tends to be somewhat eclectic. How would you describe your spiritual path?
I think eclectic is a good word to use for it. That's better than all over the place. Um, I I started out when I identified as pagan for a very long time, and in my late 20s, I I went through this phase where I wanted to figure out where some of this stuff came from that everybody was talking about, or that within the pagan community, um, there were various traditions and there were various practices, and there wasn't a lot of history being displayed behind it. Like, nobody seemed to really have a good grasp on where anything came from. And I have the ADHD and I tend to hyperfocus, so I went on this deep dive of, I just want to know where this originated. And that led to starting off just sitting in my office in Houston, Texas, going, I'm going to Google this and see what happens. And then 9 months later, I was in a living room in Northern California getting initiated into the Gardnerian tradition,
Wow.
because that's where the dive had led me in terms of figuring out the history of things and where things actually originated. um and it was a very intense, real moment for me, and it made me kind of go, well, this is real. What else is real? And so I started just kind of seeing what else was out there. And I would, read a book that would mention some obscure religious tradition from that was a flash in the pan in the 70s. And I was like, well, clearly I have to dive into that and figure out what that is. And um, and things just started not coming together like as a puzzle per se, but more of like what you would find in a crow's nest of just like shiny things that struck me as interesting. And then just I went through a process of just kind of figuring out how things work together specifically for me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when I'm with Gardnerians and doing Gardnerian things, that's a very, like, it's clearly Gardnerian. But when I'm on my own, it's just this sort of kitchen sink spirituality of all the stuff that I managed to somehow fit together.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said about the history and digging into the history, because I almost feel like the needle has moved the other way, where people discount unverifiable personal gnosis a lot more
Yeah.
today in favor of lore. And I think that there needs to be a happy medium, because
Oh, absolutely.
obviously we're not going to worship ancient deities the way they did, hundreds or even thousands of years ago. So, it's got to evolve to be a living tradition.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to me that you seem to have gone, like, in your practices, you've gone from like what I would consider very sort of left-brained and Gardnerian, very like Apollonian and very structured, to like
Mhm.
chaos magic, which is, in my experience, far more open and less structured. So
Mhm.
how did you sort of arrive at that, or how did you reconcile systems that are so extremely structured versus ones that are so unstructured?
Part of it has to do with, I guess, the structure itself, because within Gardnerian Wicca, there is a framework in terms of how like rituals are set up,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of wiggle room within the structure itself to experiment, and it's a very experiential tradition. We're actually doing things and having shared experiences. My I did not have an interest in chaos magic for a very long time. It was sort of like on the periphery of my awareness, and I associated it with like edgelords, or like just I was like, I don't know that whoever's practicing chaos magic, I'm sure they're lovely, but they're probably not my people. And it was a really good friend of mine who sort of introduced me to it in terms of his own personal practice, and sharing some stuff with me involving he was like, let's do an experiment. I'm gonna put you on a massage table, and I'm going to do energy work around you, but I'm going to have these goggles on you that pulse LED lights into your eyes, and we're going to be listening to binaural beats, and then we're going to visualize sigils. And I was like, okay, what is this? And he said, well, this is chaos magic. We're trying to see if it works. And that was kind of a revelation to me in terms of what chaos magic actually is, which is at its core just trying to get results, like,
Mhm.
finding out what works and what's going to get us results and what's going to get us repeatable results. And within the Gardnerian tradition, we have a practice that does get us the results we're looking for. So it was easy to move, chaos magic into my own paradigm in terms of, okay, well, I know that this works. What happens if I do, X, Y, and Z instead of A, B, and C, and see what happens?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's sounds interesting. I have very little experience with chaos magic. I've had friends who have practiced it, and I, never really had an impression of it as something that interested me. Sort of like you said,
Mhm.
just sort of that impression. Ththese really aren't my people. I don't know if this is for me, kind of thing. So, yeah, yeah,
And chaos
yeah.
magic
That's
was also, oh, pardon me. Chaos magic was
yeah,
also very influenced by Discordianism, which has always, like, for years I did not know any other Discordians. There's an old book called Drawing Down the Moon by Margot Adler, which was like
yep,
this. I can't remember when it originally came out, but it's gone through several prints, and it was just this like deep dive into paganism in the U.S. And at one point, she interviewed one of the founders of Discordianism, which is the modern worship of the Greek goddess Eris. And I just found that to be the most fascinating thing. So that always was sort of at the center of my personal practice. Was whatever I was doing with anybody else, that was just something that I kind of kept to myself, or had got to work with on a personal level. And the more I learned about chaos magic and the history of chaos magic, the more the influence of Discordianism on chaos magic became very apparent. So it was sort of, for me, it was very natural to move into that and be able to really expand my interest and love of Discordianism into a more magical practice.
yeah. So for listeners who might not be familiar, can you sort of describe what Discordianism is?
Oh, sure. Discordianism was founded in the late 1950s by two guys named Greg Hill and Kerry Thornley, who claimed to they said they were drinking coffee in a bowling alley one night, and a chimpanzee appeared and told them that they were basically the new prophets of the goddess Eris. And a few days later, Eris appeared to them, and announced that she was liberty and freedom, and they were now free. So they renamed themselves Malaclips the Younger and Lord Omar Khayyam Ravenhurst, and they put out a self-published book called the Principia Discordia, which was all the lessons they had learned from Eris, and they were starting this religion in her honor. It was very much, at least it started very much as a parody religion. It was just sort of lighthearted mocking of already established religious traditions. But it kind of took off, and people started having very not parody experiences with it. And in Drawing Down the Moon, Greg Hill made a comment where I guess Margot Adler had asked him if he actually believed in Eris, or if this was at all a serious religious practice. And he said, well, if I knew it was going to be real, I would have worshipped Venus instead. And so even though it started out as a joke to them, it became very real to them. And it's always sort of been in the background of pop culture. The author Robert Anton Wilson was very influenced by it, and wrote a series wrote the Illuminatus trilogy with Robert Shea that was very influenced by Discordianism, and in turn influenced Discordianism. And a lot of Wilson's ideas in the book went on to seep back into Discordianism. There was a popular band in the 90s, a British synth band called the KLF, who were a Discordian band, and people didn't realize they were Discordian, but they were doing some kind of crazy stuff in the name of Eris, and sort of accidentally becoming a very popular pop band through that. So Discordianism has been around for a while, and it's influenced a lot of things and been sort of quietly in the background. And that's just something I appreciate about it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, because I think a lot of people probably aren't familiar with Discordianism and don't necessarily know the connection between it and chaos magic. So thanks for sharing that, because setting that background I think is important, because sometimes the listeners don't know all these different traditions. And I'm glad that you mentioned Margot's book, because such a foundational book in so many ways, and it sort of opened a lot of people's eyes to all the different flavors of paganism and spirituality that were out there. I actually met Margot at Pagan Spirit Gathering probably 10-15 years ago, when she was revising the book, and I was part of Green Fairy Grove and the Between the Worlds gathering at the time that she featured in the book on the chapter on queer spirituality. So really always appreciated Margot's work. So as a queer person, what does your spirituality bring to your life that maybe people who are queer but haven't explored spirituality might not realize or might be missing?
That question makes me think of something Harry Hay once said, who was the founder of the Radical Fairies. And he said, his point of view was that queer people weren't like everyone else, because so much of the gay liberation movement at the time that he was building things was very much focused on, we're just like everyone else. Right. And he was like, we're not, we're special. And queer people are in a lot of ways very liminal people, and we do move between worlds. And we have a unique ability to do that. And exploring spirituality as a queer person has helped me really kind of embrace that, and just be as I find myself moving in different worlds. I'm in a place right now where I run this leather shop, and I'm very openly pagan at work, and I can be my full 100% authentic self, down to like people look the other way when I keep bringing Ray Dunn pottery in, because I love Ray Dunn pottery. And so like the whole store is like leather, fetish wear, Ray Dunn. And but having that background in finding things that I wanted to, that kind of helped me understand myself better and things that I wanted to share with other people. And, finding all the stuff within queer spirituality that helped me become a very robust person in a lot of ways, and being somebody who can be very true to himself. That's what I get out of it. That's
Yeah. Yeah,
that was sort of a
definitely.
rambly thing, but that was.
Yeah, I think you answered it really well, because I definitely like this idea of queer people being special, that we're not just like everyone else. And I think we're still fighting that battle today, right? With people trying to police the pride parades and what's appropriate or not appropriate, and, the acceptance of gay marriage, and a lot of people sort of moving into this. I'm currently writing a book on queer community, and I interviewed a number of people, talking about what are your expectations around community, what do you get from community, these kinds of things. And I've noticed that a lot of the younger people that I interviewed were like, well, I don't really need queer community because we're accepted now and I just hang out with straight people. And I just, it was such a weird perspective to me. And I always liked Harvey Firestein on an interview with Arsenio Hall said, queer people should be allowed to be as boring as everyone else. We're not as boring as everyone else, but we should be allowed to be. So
Absolutely.
I was like that. Yeah. So I always enjoyed that.
If somebody wants to be boring, if a queer person is like, I am boring, I am like, you know what? Half the time I am too. So that is brilliant. But there is, as we have received more mainstream acceptance, there has been sort of this interior collapse of community itself, and there is not an emphasis on history the way there used to be.
Right.
And I remember reading an article about it was a queer teenager or a gay teenager somewhere who experienced a gay bashing, and in the interview, he was talking about like, oh, I just can't believe this would ever happen. I can't believe somebody would be, angry at me because of my sexual orientation. And I was like, that is part of our history. And that's
right.
like, and I think it's something that happens in a lot of subcultures or a lot of marginalized communities when they are granted some level of acceptance. There's this impulse to sort of jettison the subculture itself, and we've been embraced by the mainstream, so we don't need each other anymore. But that acceptance is always conditional and in most cases temporary, and we can't guarantee that we will always have the acceptance. And that's why, for me, the queer community has always been so important, is because I will always find acceptance there, regardless of whether or not the mainstream accepts me.
Yeah. I think you raised really good points there. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because obviously I believe community is really important, and have been building queer communities for, better part of my life, with like festivals and retreats and the work that I do. So it always kind of feels really icky when someone says they don't need it. And I'm like, you do, you just don't realize that you do. But,
Exactly.
Looking at our political environment, you might figure it out in a little while. And that's going to be sort of tragic for you. So, yeah, definitely.
I think the potential is still there to like, I don't think the community is gone. What is it? It's like when people say chivalry is not dead, it just smells funny. I think the community kind of smells funny right now. But some of those bonds are still around. And it's like when there was the monkeypox outbreak last year, and there was an article. I'm really good about reading articles. I'm not good about remembering who wrote them or the headline or where I found them. So I'm just I'm a wealth of information that cannot be traced to any particular source. But there was an article that came out where, like, it was in something like Newsweek, but it was like, what happened to monkeypox? Where did monkeypox go? Last week we were all afraid of monkeypox, and now there are no cases. And there were these comments, and people were retweeting it, and they're like, because queer men who lived through the AIDS crisis know how to handle something like this. And as soon as the outbreak started, we rallied for vaccinations, and we made sure everybody was vaccinated, and we took care of each other, and we nipped it in the bud, which is something that the larger heterosexual community would not have been able to do.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And then, which is sort of illustrates the point of why the history piece is important, because
Mm.
when those of us who did live through the AIDS crisis are gone, if people haven't embraced that history and learned from it, then future outbreaks aren't going to be as smooth as the monkeypox one was. So the
Yeah.
history is definitely very important. So, I want to talk about your book that you co-wrote with Evo. So Aries, the Virgo Witch, divining the details. So I know Llewellyn's doing this series with all the different astrological signs. So my first question is, why Virgo?
So I first of all, I am a Virgo. So I got every book in the Sun Sign series was co-authored by somebody of that particular sign. So
Cool. Okay.
you have Evo's very formidable astrological knowledge for half the book, and then you have somebody kind of living as that sign to share their perspective as well. I got asked because um, I I had written on my blog a parody review of Storm Fairy Wolf's book, The Satyr's Kiss, where somebody had sent me a promotional copy or an advanced review copy. And so I wrote this review where I was saying how disappointed I was because I thought it was going to be Narnia / fiction and just tearing up Storm. And he's a friend of mine, so it was like I knew he would
Sure.
think it was funny. Like I knew it was
Yeah.
all done with love. But then he messaged me one day and said my editor would like to speak to you, and I was like, "Oh, I've been blacklisted. I picked the wrong target." And so I was like, "Well, I'll just go back to Pathos and explain that I got us sued by Llewellyn Publications, and I'm sure they'll understand." But I reached out to his editor and said, "Hi, Storm suggested that I speak with you," and she said, "Yes, we would like you to be a part of this series." So apparently my parody review was the reason I got asked to be the Virgo Witch, which I had never written a book before. I'd always kind of stuck to blogging and social media and things like that. Um, and I was dealing with some imposter syndrome because astrology is not my strongest suit, and I don't know, or at the time I was like, I don't even know if I really fit the stereotype of a Virgo. And a couple of months after I started working on the book, I did a phone conference with Evo, and he said, "Well, how's it going?" And I said, "Well, I got writer's block and I freaked out and had a panic attack over it. So I disassociated and I played on TikTok for a month." And he said, "Oh, that's because you're a Virgo." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, that in that case, everything's great. I can do this now." And that was sort of the little bump I needed to actually realize that I could do it.
Yeah. I love that story. Yeah, and the writer's block and like finding something else to do is so real, because I'm working with a book writing coach, but I'm still like, sometimes I go to my sessions and I'm like, well, I started to work on that part and then I froze up and I went and did something else. So yeah. So, and I'm not a Virgo, I'm a Sagittarius. So, should be easy for me, but something about
Mhm.
writing, I can talk all day long, but when it comes to putting it down on paper, it's much harder.
It is. It's
So,
I think I know for me there's this idea that like the book I want to write is in my head, and there's a fear of getting it down on paper where it's not going to be the way I wanted it to. It's not going to turn out the way I
yeah,
wanted it to, and so I freeze up on that of
yeah,
or I had to I'm the second book that I'm working on right now. I was looking at a stack of books on chaos magic in my living room and thinking, there's no way I can put all this in my book. This is overwhelming. And then I was like, but that's not your book. That's their books. So you don't need to worry about putting what's in their books in your book. Just focus on what
yeah.
you want to say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so hard, and I think that people who have perspectives to share sometimes get in that imposter syndrome. I have a good
Mm.
friend who's really talented psychic medium and spiritual coach, and she gets on Instagram and she's like, I feel like I see people say something and I'm like, oh, that resonates with what I want to say, but then I feel like I'm not being original, like I'm copying everyone else. And so
Hmm.
it's interesting how people struggle with that. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about Virgo Witch. Like, why would someone want to read this book?
It's so the idea behind the Sun Sign series in general is for witches of every astrological sign to be able to connect more with themselves and kind of draw power from their sign. Like, how
Yeah.
to not only identify as your sign, but to work with the archetypes and energies that make up that sign. And so every book has a vast amount of information about the sign itself, including like if you're a Virgo moon or Virgo rising, there's info on that. And along with there are spells and rituals, and there are other contributors who put in recipes and little biographies. Um, for for me as a Virgo, and Virgo being, as Evo puts it, the most neurotic of the signs, my perspective in writing the book was you are not alone. Like, however you are presenting as a Virgo, I promise you're not having to deal with this by yourself. We are in this together. So I really wanted to write a book that made people realize that, like, however it is that your Virgo-ness is expressing itself, we've all gone through it. And it's kind of like something you pick up that I picked up in 12-step recovery, where I went in to recovery thinking nobody will understand what I've been through. And within like a week, I was like, oh, they've all been through exactly what I've been through. This is kind of demoralizing in a way, because I'm not the little special cupcake I thought I was. And so I kind of used that same outlook in writing a book for Virgos, because I do think Virgos can get very down on ourselves very easily, or get into the why am I like this, and so at least that way nobody's gonna no Virgo who reads this book will feel alone anymore. They won't feel like they're the only one having to deal with being a Virgo.
That seems to be kind of a theme for you, of that shared experience, because earlier we talked about community, and it's obvious that, like, through the leather and fetish community and different community is very important to you, the 12 step, and now writing this book and taking that perspective. It seems like community is sort of a thread that runs through everything for you.
It really is. And I have never I don't think I will ever be an expert on anything, but I very much would like to be a guide and kind of help people find what they're looking for, or find where they're supposed to be, or help them become who they're supposed to be. When I blog, and I write a lot about witchcraft and chaos magic and paganism in general, but a lot of the topics that I write about are things that I don't know much about. So my perspective is, we're going to go through this together, because I know there are other people who are interested in this. So I'm going to figure it out, and I'm just dragging all of you along with me, so we can all kind of do it together.
I love that about being a guide, because that's really, we need guides. People don't want to be spoon fed, but they do need someone to kind of guide and take them by the hand, and sort of help them connect to the resources and the people that are going to be really instrumental in their lives and in helping them discover who they are and live that. So I appreciate that imagery of a guide, as opposed to a teacher or a mentor, or some of those other kinds of ways that we look at that. So yeah. As we're starting to reach kind of the end of our interview here, is there any thing that we haven't discussed that you just really is like burning, that I want to bring this up to listeners?
There's nothing burning, which is a good thing. Every time I've done a podcast, there's always that feeling of afterwards of like, well, here's the list of things I forgot to say. But I think we covered all of it. I think that the one thing I would like to say is that, regardless of what aspect of queer spirituality or spirituality in general that someone may be interested in, there is a place for them within it. I do think, especially in kind of, paganism and the occult on social media, there is quite a bit of, I don't like the term, but I'll go ahead and use it, gatekeeping, in terms of, like you have the witchcraft influencer on TikTok saying, you'll never do things as well as I will. but
Right.
here's a little thing that you can try, but it won't be as good as when I do it. Or at least that's the attitude that's often reflected. And I disagree with that attitude. I think we all have a remarkable amount of potential. And if we are being pulled in a particular direction, or if we are feeling overly drawn towards a path, there is more than likely a place for us somewhere within that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really powerful message, because that's a pet peeve of mine when I read books and the author says, well, not everyone can do this, only certain people, or there's special gifts. And I'm like, no, that's all BS. Like, anyone can learn. It's like any other skill. You practice and you get better at it.
And
some people,
I just made a
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Some people it might come naturally, right? Like, but anyone can do it. So,
well, and it's a joke my mom used to make about, what do you call the person with the lowest grades in their medical school class? A doctor. You don't have to be the best at everything. You can still, achieve your own potential. That's yours. You don't have to measure yourself by other people's successes.
Right. Absolutely. And that's such an important message, because I think that so much of life is about that comparison. I coach spiritual entrepreneurs, and I get this all the time, where they're watching other people's social media and being like, oh, I'm not as good as them, or they're making more money than me, and all of it, all of the comparison. And we just need to stop that and just really like look at who we are, and just be the best version of who we can be. So yeah, definitely. So how do people get in touch with you, keep up with what you're doing?
Well, I have they can always go to thumperforge.com, which is just sort of, it's not the most intricate of websites, but it'll have just information of what I'm doing and what I'm working on. If you go directly to pathos.com/blogs/5fold-law, that'll take people directly to my blog. And on most social media platforms, I'm just at Fivefold Law.
Okay.
So on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, that's where you can find me. Or not Twitter, TikTok.
Okay.
I fell away from the Twitter. I fell away from the Twitter graph, but I'm
so many of us have, right?
But everywhere else, if you just Google Fivefold Law, I come up.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we'll include some of those links in the description accompanying this episode, so people can just click those links and go find you. So any parting words of wisdom for listeners before we close our episode?
I will reiterate something I just said in a TikTok video, where as I said at the beginning of this, I tend to hyperfocus. And when it comes to the occult, I will just fall merrily down any number of different rabbit holes and spend quality time in each one of them. But whatever it is that is holding my interest, or that I, wake up one morning realizing that I've read 17 books on, or whatever, somebody inevitably says, you're not allowed to do that. And a lot of times it's, oh, you're Wiccan. Wiccans can't do that. And it's never a Wiccan saying it. It's always somebody outside of Wicca who has an idea of what Wicca is, and therefore assumes that they know what my limitations are. But I have never been one to constrain myself by other people's limitations. And, if somebody wants to see me or perceive me as somebody with restricted potential or restricted abilities because of my background and practices, that's okay, because it's not my problem. That is for them to work out. And I'm not going to let any belief held by somebody else dictate what I am or am not capable of.
Yeah. I think that's great advice for everyone. So
I encourage everyone to do the same.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and sharing your thoughts on queer spirituality. It's been really interesting, and I've learned a little bit about chaos magic today. So
you're very welcome. I had a blast. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Queer Spirituality Podcast with Julie and Crosson-Hill. If If you enjoyed this show, please consider leaving a rating on whatever site you get your podcasts at. Rating the show allows other people to discover it and be exposed to these ideas around queer spirituality. You can also find my blog and past episodes of this podcast at www.queerspirituality.net. That's www.queerspirituality.net. You can also there find links to the Queer Spirituality Facebook group, my various social channels where you can get involved in the discussion or send me your feedback or questions or things you'd like to hear on the show. Thank you again for listening and for your support. Bright blessings.